Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Machine. Elara Vance inhabited the spaces between people, the corners of rooms, the gaps in conversations, the margins of her own family's existence. At 26 years old, she had perfected the art of being a shadow. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the dim light of her father's study. Her gray eyes perpetually cast downward, her voice a whisper that required others to lean in to hear. The Vance mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast had once been a symbol of untouchable wealth, a sprawling Victorian beast with marble floors and stained glass windows. But now it was a monument to decline, each room a carefully maintained fiction of prosperity masking the rot beneath. Elara had spent a decade holding that fiction together, managing her father Arthur's gambling debts, orchestrating his cover stories, cleaning up after his humiliations, and absorbing the emotional fallout with the stoicism of someone who had long ago decided that her own needs were a luxury the family could not afford. Her sister Beatrice, 2 years her junior, moved through the same mansion like a peacock, all flash and loud demands, seemingly unburdened by the weight that bent Elara's shoulders. Beatrice had never needed to understand the ledger that governed their lives. She was the asset, the beautiful thing to be displayed. Elara was the accountant of suffering, the invisible mechanism that kept their world from imploding. She wore high-quality but muted fabrics, pinned her dark hair back in a severe bun, held herself as if taking up space was an imposition. She had learned long ago that the less she was seen, the less she could be hurt. But invisibility, she was about to discover, was a fragile armor, one that would shatter the moment someone truly refused to let her hide. Arthur Vance took a long, shaky sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid trembling in his glass. Elara watched him with a practiced neutrality, her hands folded demurely in front of her. She knew what was coming, had braced herself for it, but the words still struck her like a physical blow. "They want you, Elara." Arthur's voice was thick with shame. "Thorne's people, they want you as collateral." Elara's heart pounded in her ears, but she did not allow her expression to change. "Me?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur nodded, his eyes downcast. "They say you're valuable, rare, a good investment." He shuddered, taking another gulp of whiskey. "I've tried to reason with them, to buy more time, but they won't budge. They want you, Elara, and they want you now." Elara felt the weight of those words settle upon her, a mantle of dread that threatened to crush the breath from her lungs. She had always known that her family's fortunes rested upon her shoulders, that her very existence was a bargaining chip in the high-stakes game of Chicago society. But to be offered up as collateral, to be traded like a commodity, the thought made her skin crawl. "What of Beatrice?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Surely they would be interested in her as well. Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "Beatrice? No, they want you, the ghost, they call you, the one who keeps this house standing." He shook his head, his expression twisted with self-loathing. "I failed you, Elara. I failed us all." Elara felt a flicker of pity for her father, this broken man who had gambled away their family's legacy. But it was a fleeting emotion, quickly smothered by the weight of her own dread. She knew what she had to do, what she'd always known she would have to do. "Very well," she said, her voice steady. "I will go to them." Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a desperate hope. "You will?" he breathed. "You would do that for us?" Elara nodded, her jaw set with grim determination. "I will do what I must to protect this family." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "But I want your word that you will use this opportunity to right your wrongs. No more gambling, no more debts. You will rebuild the Vance name, or I swear I will never forgive you." Arthur nodded, his eyes shining with tears. "I swear it, Elara. I swear it on my life." Elara held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception. Satisfied, she inclined her head. "Then I will go to Thorne." Without another word, she turned and left the study, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Elara watched as Beatrice and their mother drifted away, the weight of their words settling heavily upon her. She knew that her role in this family had always been that of a martyr, a silent sufferer whose sole purpose was to shield the others from the consequences of their own follies. But in this moment, she felt the full extent of that burden, the crushing realization that she had never truly been seen as an equal, only as a means to an end. Her gaze drifted across the opulent ballroom, taking in the glittering chandeliers, the swirling gowns, and the carefully cultivated facades of Chicago's elite. This was the world she had been born into, a world of privilege and power, where one's worth was measured not by the content of one's character, but by the size of one's bank account and the prestige of one's name. Elara had always been an outsider in this world, a ghost in the machine, as it were. She had learned early on that the only way to survive was to make herself invisible, to blend into the background and let her sister and her parents take center stage. But now, as she watched Beatrice and Victoria engage in their calculated social maneuverings, she felt a surge of resentment. Why, she wondered, had she been the one to sacrifice her own dreams and aspirations in order to keep this family afloat? Why had she been the one to shoulder the burden of their debts and their scandals, all while her sister basked in the adulation of their peers? It wasn't fair, and in that moment, Elara felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. But even as that spark burned, she knew that she could not act on it. Her family's survival depended on her continued self-abnegation, on her willingness to be the martyr they so desperately needed. And so, with a heavy heart, she forced herself to push those feelings of resentment back down, to bury them beneath the layers of stoicism and self-control that had become her armor. As she stood there, sipping her untouched champagne, Elara caught the eye of a man across the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jaw and piercing eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. She recognized him immediately, Silas Thorne, the ruthless businessman who had been hounding her father for repayment of his debts. And in that moment, she knew that her moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Elara stood in the foyer, her suitcase a single point of focus in the vast, echoing space. The weight of her father's words still hung heavy in the air, a sentence passed without appeal. Silas Thorne had called in the debt, and she was the collateral, a wife, a guarantee, a means to an end. She had not cried, nor had she raised her voice in protest. There was no point. The papers were signed, the decision made. All that remained was the execution. The front door opened, and a man stepped into the frame, silhouetted against the darkness. Elara recognized him immediately. Marcus Thorne, Silas's lieutenant, a man whose very presence exuded a quiet, lethal intensity. His gaze met hers with a nod of professional courtesy. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low and measured. "I'm Marcus. I'll be taking you to the conservatory now." Elara picked up her suitcase and followed him without hesitation, her step steady and her expression impassive. She did not look back at the mansion, nor did she call out to her mother or her sister. This was her path, and she would walk it alone. In the hallway, she passed her father, Arthur, his face ravaged by guilt and cowardice. He reached out, as if to touch her arm, but Elara was already moving past him, the moment unfinished. This, too, was a farewell, though neither of them would acknowledge it as such. Marcus opened the rear door of the waiting limousine, and Elara slid into the leather-appointed interior. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling, and the tinted windows rendered the outside world a gray blur. The partition between the driver and the passenger cabin was opaque, creating a sense of absolute isolation. The silence inside the vehicle was total, the sound-dampening technology absorbing all external noise, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the rhythm of Elara's own breathing. She sat in the middle of the vast back seat, her suitcase a small, solitary presence beside her. As the limousine pulled away from the curb and into the night, Elara stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the receding image of the Vance mansion. It was the last time she would see her family home, the last tangible link to the life she had known. From this moment on, she would be Silas Thorne's, bound to him by a contract she had no choice but to accept. The car moved swiftly through the deserted streets, the city's nighttime hush muffling the sound of its passage. Elara felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the events unfold from a great distance. She knew that she should be afraid, that she should be mourning the loss of her freedom, her autonomy. But in that moment, all she felt was a deep, bone-weary resignation. She had always been the one to sacrifice, the one to bear the burden of her family's mistakes. And now she was being asked to do so again, to surrender herself to a man she had never met, to become a pawn in a game she did not understand. But even as the weight of that realization settled upon her, she found a strange sense of purpose, a determination to see this through no matter the cost. Silas's dark eyes bore into Elara as she read through the dense legal contract, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The weight of what she was about to do settled upon her, a suffocating mantle that threatened to steal the very air from her lungs. Yet, even as her heart raced, Elara forced herself to remain outwardly calm, her expression betraying none of the turmoil churning within. She had made her choice, and now she must see it through, no matter the cost. When she reached the end of the document, she lifted her gaze to meet Silas's, her steely gray eyes reflecting a quiet resolve. "If I sign this, I'm severing every tie to my family, am I correct?" Silas's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing across his features. "That is the condition," he replied, his voice low and measured. "You are mine now. They are nothing." The words struck Elara like a physical blow, but she refused to flinch. This was the price she had chosen to pay, the sacrifice she had made to protect her family. And now, as she took the pen Silas offered, she knew that there was no turning back. With a steady hand, Elara signed her name at the bottom of the contract, her signature a clean, economical stroke that sealed her fate. In that moment, she was no longer Elara Vance, the dutiful daughter of a crumbling dynasty. She was Elara Thorne, the wife of the Nameless One, the property of the Chicago underworld. Silas collected the signed documents, his movements deliberate and final. "Welcome to your new life, Elara," he said, and the way he said her name, slowly and deliberately, sent a chill down her spine. Elara sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the tinted windows as the limousine sped through the darkened streets of Chicago. The city she had known her entire life had become a blur of lights and shadows, a reflection of the new reality she now found herself in. As the vehicle carried her away from the Vance mansion, Elara felt a deep sense of loss, a mourning for the life she had once known. But beneath that sorrow, there was also a glimmer of something else, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. She may have signed away her freedom, but she would not surrender her will. Elara Thorne would find a way to survive, to carve out a space for herself in this new world she'd been thrust into. And perhaps, in the process, she might even discover a way to reclaim the parts of herself she had long ago sacrificed. Chapter 2: The Cage and the Revelation. The limousine delivered Elara to an estate that seemed to exist outside of time and logic. A sprawling mansion set back from Lakeshore Drive, isolated from the rest of Chicago by gates and high walls. The obsidian conservatory at its heart was unlike anything she had ever seen, a glass dome filled with carnivorous plants, their mouths open in silent hunger, their fronds reaching toward her as she passed through. Here, in this space where every movement echoed and every shadow was accounted for, Elara's techniques of invisibility became liabilities. Silas would not allow her to fade. He demanded presence, demanded acknowledgement, demanded that she inhabit her body and her voice. The marriage contract was signed, but the marriage itself, the true marriage, would be fought in the spaces between them, in the silences that Silas refused to let her hide in. And then came the revelation that would shatter the fragile equilibrium she had constructed. Silas Thorne had been searching for her for a decade, ever since she had shown him mercy when she was 16, and he was simply a wounded man on the edge of death. That single act of kindness had become the organizing principle of his entire existence. And now, standing in the glass cage, Elara would have to confront the terrifying possibility that she was not invisible at all. She was obsessed over, studied, claimed. Elara stood in the center of the obsidian conservatory, the vast glass dome enveloping her in a suffocating silence. The exotic carnivorous plants that filled the space seemed to leer at her, their lethal appendages reaching out as if to snatch her from her solitary spot on the polished marble floor. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and jasmine, a cloying fragrance that made Elara's skin crawl. Outside, the constant patter of rain against the glass only heightened her sense of isolation. There was no place to hide here, no shadows to melt into. Every inch of this space was designed to strip away her carefully cultivated invisibility. Elara stood rigidly, her hands empty, acutely aware of the white silk gown that clung to her frame. The garment, tailored to her exact measurements, was a visceral reminder that nothing in this place was left to chance. Silas Thorne had orchestrated every detail, down to the very clothes she wore. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, and Elara's gaze snapped to the eastern archway. Silas emerged, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. His eyes immediately found her, and he said nothing, simply observing her, cataloging her discomfort. Marcus, ever the silent sentinel, stood at the entrance, his presence a clear security measure. "This is the conservatory," Silas's voice carried effortlessly through the glass. It was designed to remove ambiguity. "You cannot hide here, Elara. There are no shadows, no corners, no places to make yourself invisible. I require presence." The idea that her survival mechanism, the invisibility that had kept her alive, was no longer functional filled her with a primal dread. "What exactly do you require of me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas moved closer, each step echoing through the chamber. "I require that you stop pretending. I require that you speak when spoken to. I require that you look at me when I address you. I require that you stop being a ghost in my house." He circled her slowly, his gaze appraising. "You will have everything you could want: luxury, safety, security. What you will not have is the option to disappear." Elara kept her eyes forward, hyper-aware of his proximity. "I understand," she said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. She did not understand. She did not know how to be present, for presence only led to scrutiny, and scrutiny to judgment, and judgment to pain. Silas completed his circle and stood before her, reaching out to gently take her chin in his hand, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "Look at me," he commanded, and Elara did, her eyes locking with his. What she saw in his expression was not cruelty, but something far more unsettling: recognition. "Who do you see when you look in a mirror?" Silas asked, the question unexpected and intimate. Elara's throat constricted. She had never truly looked at herself. She had only ever looked through herself. "I see. Efficiency." Silas's hand dropped away, but his eyes never left hers. "That will change," he said, the words a threat and a promise all at once. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the glass chamber, leaving Elara alone in the center of the mirror-bright floor, unable to escape her own reflection. Elara sat rigidly at the vanity, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the ornate mirror. The master bedroom was a lavish display of wealth, all gleaming surfaces and opulent fabrics, but it felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to press in, as if the very space were alive and watching her. The sound of the door opening behind her made Elara's spine stiffen, but she did not turn. "I didn't expect you until later," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Silas moved across the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. Elara watched in the mirror as he placed something carefully on the mantel, an old, frayed handkerchief stained with dried blood. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Elara turned from the mirror, crossing the room to pick up the handkerchief. The moment her fingers touched the worn fabric, a memory surfaced, a memory she had long since buried. She was 16 years old, walking home from her volunteer shift, when she had found a young man bleeding in an alley, left for dead. Something about his broken, vulnerable state had triggered a fierce protectiveness in her, and she had bound his wounds, given him water, and sat with him until help arrived. Elara looked up at Silas, understanding dawning on her. "That was you," she whispered. Silas's expression was carved from stone. "I was bleeding out in an alley behind a strip club on the south side," he said. "I had just lost a war with a crew that was trying to move into my territory. I was alone, abandoned by my own men, and I was going to die. And then you came, a girl in a school uniform with soft hands and the kind of mercy that doesn't exist in my world." Elara sank down onto the edge of the bed, her mind reeling. "You don't remember me. You can't," she said, the words barely audible. "I remember every second of it," Silas countered, and there was something raw in his voice, something that sounded almost like pain. "I remember the color of your eyes. I remember the sound of your voice. I remember the way you looked at me like I wasn't a monster. And I remember that you told me you hoped I would be okay, and then you disappeared, and I spent the next 10 years trying to find you." Elara felt something fracture inside her chest. All her life, she had been invisible, a ghost in her own life, and this man, this powerful, terrifying man, had been searching for her, had made her the centerpiece of an obsession that had lasted a decade. The realization was both validating and unbearable. "I don't know who you were looking for, but it wasn't me," she said, her voice trembling. "That girl was a ghost. She was nobody." Silas crossed the room and gripped her shoulders, his eyes burning into hers. "That girl was the only person who ever showed me that I was something other than a weapon," he said. "She was the only proof I ever had that I wasn't irredeemable. And I've spent every day since finding that girl again." Elara pulled away from him, her voice rising for the first time since entering his house. "You didn't find me, you bought me. You have a version of me, a woman defined entirely by your memory of a girl you barely knew. I'm not her. I will never be her. I'm the invisible daughter of a gambling addict, and I agreed to this because I had no other choice. But don't mistake me for some noble martyr in your salvation narrative." Silas stepped back, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the first real acknowledgement that Elara was not the malleable asset he had imagined her to be. "But you're here now, and that's all that matters." Elara did not argue further, but inside her, a seed of fury had been planted. It was not directed at Silas alone, it was directed at the entire machinery of her life, at every force that had conspired to reduce her to a transaction, a memory, a ghost. For the first time, her anger was not turned inward, but outward, and this rage became the fuel that would eventually transform her into something far more dangerous than any invisible martyr could ever be. Elara watched in stunned silence as Beatrice was dragged from the room, her shrill accusations echoing down the hall. The sound of the rain pounding against the windows seemed to amplify the heavy silence that settled between her and Silas. Silas turned to Elara, his gaze cool and assessing. "I assume you had no prior knowledge of this little infiltration?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. Elara swallowed hard, acutely aware of the fragility of her position. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea she would come here." She paused, then added, "I'm sorry." Silas arched a brow. "Sorry?" he repeated. "For what, precisely? For the breach in security, or for the fact that your sister has now become a liability?" Elara felt her stomach twist with dread. "I thought she was content to live in her own world of luxury, oblivious to the consequences of my actions." "Apparently you underestimated her," Silas said, his tone deceptively mild. He moved closer, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Elara, how well do you really know your sister?" Elara felt a familiar sense of unease settle over her. "Well enough to know that she's impulsive and narcissistic," she said carefully. "But I never thought she would go this far. I thought I had protected her from the ugliness of our family's situation." Silas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what of your own role in all of this?" he asked. "You've been playing the martyr for years, haven't you? Sacrificing yourself to keep your family afloat, all the while resenting them for it." Elara felt a flicker of anger ignite within her. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't have a choice, didn't you?" Silas countered, his eyes boring into hers. "You could have walked away, Elara. You could have let your family crumble and started a new life for yourself. But you didn't, did you? You stayed because deep down, you needed to be needed. You needed to be the one who held everything together, even if it meant sacrificing your own happiness." Elara opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Because in that moment she realized that Silas was right. She had clung to her role as the family's savior, even as it slowly eroded her own sense of self. And now, her sister's reckless actions had put that fragile balance in jeopardy. Silas stepped closer, his expression inscrutable. "I will deal with your sister," he said, his voice low and measured. "But I need to know that I can trust you, Elara. That you are not a liability to me, as she has now become." Elara felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. She knew that Silas's trust was a fragile thing, and that she had already tested the limits of his patience. "I am loyal to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have no desire to betray you." Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "See that you don't," he said, his tone brooking no argument. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Elara alone with the weight of her own decisions. Silas's voice was cold when he spoke, the words cutting through the silence of the obsidian conservatory. "Your sister claims you've been passing information to your father. She claims you're working against me. She claims this entire marriage is a coordinated effort to infiltrate my organization." Elara felt a flicker of unease, but she did not deny the possibility. "I haven't spoken to my father since the night I left. I haven't answered any of Beatrice's attempts to contact me, but I understand why she would frame it that way. She needs an explanation for why I'm not saving her anymore. She needs to believe that I'm choosing something or someone over my family obligation." "Are you?" Silas asked, the simplicity of the question belying the weight of everything that had transpired since the night of the contract. Elara finally looked directly at him, and her eyes carried a truth that had been building inside her since the moment he had revealed the handkerchief. "I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing survival. I'm choosing not to be defined by sacrifice. Whether I'm choosing you or choosing freedom from my family, I'm not entirely sure. But I'm not choosing them, and that has to mean something." Silas moved closer to her, his predatory grace replaced with something more vulnerable. "I spent a decade searching for you because I believed that mercy I witnessed was proof that I was worth saving. I built an entire empire on the foundation of finding you again. And now that I have you, I'm terrified that you'll prove me wrong, that you'll turn out to be an asset like everything else in my life, something that can be exploited or lost." Elara felt the armor she had been constructing begin to crack, but instead of collapsing into his arms, she stepped away from him. "You're still looking for that 16-year-old girl. You're still trying to be saved. But I can't be the proof of your redemption, Silas. I can't be anyone's salvation. I'm not even my own." Silas's face hardened, and he said, "Then what are you?" Elara stood in the center of the glass cage, and something fundamental shifted in her bearing. "I'm going to become someone you actually need to fear. Not because I'm loyal to you, but because I'm finally loyal to myself." The declaration, this moment of reclamation, became the true turning point. Silas realized that the woman he had obsessed over was not the victim he had imagined, but a force that had been dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to emerge. And Elara, speaking the words aloud, understood for the first time that invisibility had been a choice, and it was a choice she was no longer willing to make. Elara moved through the darkened servant corridors of the Syndicate Council chamber, her footsteps silent as she navigated the labyrinth of hallways. This subterranean world, once a place of dread, had become her domain. She had studied the patterns, the blind spots, the rhythms of this domain, and now she wielded that knowledge like a weapon. Slipping into the main chamber, Elara's sharp eyes scanned the room, cataloging every detail. Maps, ledgers, and documents were spread across the long, rough-hewn table, evidence of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. She began to methodically photograph the pages, committing names and connections to memory. As she worked, a name on one of the ledgers caught her eye: Julian Vane. The shock of seeing her family name arrested her, and she delved deeper, tracing the threads that connected this man to the unraveling of her own life. Julian had been an associate of her father's, a man betrayed in a business deal years ago. And now he had orchestrated the downfall of everyone Elara loved, using her father's gambling addiction as the first domino to fall. Elara's hands trembled as she realized the truth. Her family's crisis had not been an accident, but a calculated cascade of events designed to place her in this exact position. She was not an asset that had been accidentally acquired. She was the linchpin of a revenge plot that had been decades in the making. Returning to the master bedroom, Elara considered going to Silas with this information. But she hesitated, knowing that he would view this as an attempt to prove her loyalty through service. She would be validating his original assessment of her as useful, as instrumental, so instead she did something far more dangerous. She began her own investigation, gathering evidence not to present to Silas, but to use independently. As Elara pored over the documents, a plan began to take shape in her mind. She would use Silas's own organization against him, leveraging the cracks in his empire to expose the truth. But this was no longer about saving her family or proving her worth to Silas. This was about reclaiming her own agency, her own power. She was no longer the ghost, the human payment, the martyr. She was going to become a force to be reckoned with, one that Silas Thorne would have to fear. With a newfound determination, Elara set to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pieced together the evidence. She would not be a pawn in this game any longer. She would take control, and she would do it on her own terms. Silas entered the master bedroom, his usually composed demeanor betrayed by the tension in his jaw and the faint traces of blood under his fingernails. Elara stood at the window, watching the relentless rain batter the city below, her posture rigid with a sense of foreboding. "Your sister has been whispering in the ears of my organization," Silas said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The rumors have spread. There's talk that you've been compromised, that your family sent you here as a saboteur." "It wasn't my sister alone. Julian Vane has been orchestrating this for years. He used my father's weakness to set all of this in motion. Beatrice is just a pawn, an easy one to manipulate because she hates me." Silas processed this information, his brow furrowing. "How do you know this?" Elara finally turned to meet his gaze, her eyes cold and unwavering. "Because I've been investigating. Because I've been studying your security systems, your lieutenant's patterns, and your organizational structure. Because I've discovered that your closest advisors, at least 3 of them, are working with Julian Vane to destabilize your control." Silas's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise and something darker crossing his features. "Infiltrating my organization, gathering intelligence. This is exactly what Beatrice said you were doing." Elara felt the ground shift beneath her. The evidence she had gathered to save herself was now being reframed as proof of her disloyalty. "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "No." Silas's voice was ice. "You were trying to prove your loyalty. You were trying to become useful, which means you're exactly what I feared. Another transaction, another person willing to use me for their own survival." "That's not true," Elara protested, but even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. She had begun her investigation partly as an attempt to prove her worth, to demonstrate that she was valuable beyond her ability to be bartered. But something had shifted as she worked. The investigation had become less about proving her loyalty and more about claiming agency. Silas turned away from her, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed to bend the very architecture of the room. "You're confined to the master bedroom until this is resolved. Marcus will ensure your compliance. You will not leave this room. You will not speak to anyone. You will remain visible to me, which means you remain in captivity." "Silas," Elara began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I gave you a choice. I said you could be invisible or present, and you could choose which. You chose to be present, which means you're responsible for every consequence of that choice." With that, he left, and Elara was locked in the master bedroom, confined by the very walls that were meant to contain her vulnerability. She had won the investigation, but lost the war. She had proven her intelligence, but sacrificed her trust. The dark night of the soul had begun, and Elara realized that no matter what she did or who she became, she was still defined by her utility, still trapped in the ledger of transactions that had governed her entire life. Elara sat in the master bedroom, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the faint sounds of activity beyond the locked door. Days had passed, and the isolation had become a crucible, forging her resolve into something sharper, more focused. She knew now that she would not be able to prove her innocence to argument or evidence alone. Silas had made it clear that her word held no weight, that she had irrevocably shattered his trust. No. She would have to prove her loyalty through action, an action so unambiguous, so clearly in service of Silas's interests that it could not be misinterpreted. Elara began to consider what that action might be, and the answer became clear. She would expose the traitors and Julian Vane not through Silas's organization, but by standing directly in the council chamber and presenting the evidence herself. It was a risk, a gamble that could cost her everything, but it was the only path forward that felt truly her own. Gathering a sheet of paper, Elara composed a letter to Marcus, slipping it under the door with the meal tray. In the letter, she requested, not demanded, an audience with the council. She outlined what she had discovered, but framed it not as an investment in Silas's confidence, but as a simple fact that existed whether or not he believed her. I know that I have lost your trust, she wrote. I accept that consequence. But the information I have gathered is not an investment in your confidence in me. It is a simple fact that exists whether or not you believe me. I am prepared to present this to the council and accept whatever judgment follows. When Marcus delivered the letter to Silas, the response came swiftly. Elara would be allowed to address the council, but only if she submitted to a lie detector test. It was a profound humiliation, a statement that her word was worthless without mechanical verification. Elara accepted the condition without resistance. She had learned that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. As preparations were made for the presentation, Elara noticed a subtle shift in Marcus's demeanor. He no longer viewed her as a security liability, but as someone attempting to navigate an impossible situation. His respect, though cautious, had begun to form the foundation of something like an alliance. On the eve of the council meeting, Silas entered the room where Elara was compiling her evidence. If you're lying, he said, his voice low and dangerous, I will know, and if I know, there will be consequences that extend beyond mere imprisonment. But I'm not lying, and even if I were, I'm no longer operating from a place of fear. I'm operating from a place of choice. That's the difference. Silas steadied her, and something in his expression softened slightly. I want to believe you, he said. I know, Elara replied, but wanting isn't enough. You're going to have to choose to trust me, and that's terrifying for you because you've spent your entire life believing that trust is weakness. Chapter 3. The Reclamation. Elara Vance would stand before the council, the shadowy collective of architects who govern Silas's empire, not as a supplicant seeking mercy, but as a woman presenting fact to an audience of men conditioned to believe that truth is whatever can be established through force. The lie detector test was administered, and she passed each interrogation with a clarity that seemed to surprise even those administering it. The evidence she had gathered was presented methodically, relentlessly, and with the kind of cold precision that transcended emotion or self-interest. By the time she finished her testimony, 3 of Silas's closest lieutenants had been identified as traitors, and Julian Vane's decade-long conspiracy had been exposed in its entirety. But the true climax would come not in the moment of revelation, but in what came after. In Elara's public reclamation of her own choice, her declaration that she was no longer a pawn in a game played by men with vendettas. And in that declaration, Silas Thorne would finally understand that the woman he had obsessed over was not the ghost he had imagined, but something far more powerful, a woman who had chosen him, not because she was trapped, but because she had decided to stop hiding from her own agency. Elara Vance Thorne stood at the center of the syndicate council chamber, the harsh lighting illuminating her like a solitary pillar in the cavernous darkness. Around the slate table, the 12 most powerful lieutenants of Silas Thorne's criminal empire sat in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the woman who had dared to breach the sanctum of their private domain. With methodical precision, Elara presented the evidence she had painstakingly gathered, financial records, encrypted communiques, and damning testimony that exposed the treachery of 3 of Silas's closest advisors. As each piece of the puzzle fell into place, the council members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying a growing unease. This was no desperate plea, no attempt to bargain for mercy. This was a surgical dismantling of their carefully constructed power structure, carried out with a clinical detachment that bordered on the sublime. When Elara turned her attention to Julian Vane, the man who had orchestrated the downfall of her family, her voice carried a weight that surprised even herself. Julian Vane is a man who has spent the better part of a decade orchestrating the downfall of everyone I have ever loved, she declared. He used my father's weakness as the first domino in a cascade designed to place me in this exact position. He believed that through me he could access Silas's organization and destabilize it from within. What he did not anticipate is that I would choose to stop being invisible. I would choose to stop being useful. I would choose to be present. Marcus, Silas's most trusted lieutenant, rose to the council's defense, presenting his own findings that corroborated Elara's evidence. The lie detector tests were administered, and the 3 accused traitors were swiftly removed from the chamber, their fates left unspoken but understood by all present. Julian Vane, however, remained, his expression one of grudging respect as he regarded the woman who had so thoroughly dismantled his carefully laid plans. "You're the first Vance to have any spine," he said. "Your father was always weak. Your sister is pathetic. But you're almost impressive." Elara did not accept the compliment. "You spent years destroying my family because my father betrayed you in a business deal. But you didn't destroy my family because of what he did to you. You destroyed it because his weakness gave you permission to believe that weakness deserved punishment. You used my shame, my family's decline, my own invisibility as tools of revenge. And you failed because you underestimated what a woman could become when she finally stopped hiding." Julian's smile faded, and he challenged Elara. "You think this is a victory? You think you've won something here?" "No," Elara replied, her eyes unwavering. "I think I've made a choice. And that's something you've never had the capacity to understand." As Julian was led away, Elara turned to address the council directly. "My father gambled away my future and bartered my life to pay his debts. My sister conspired with my family's enemy to destroy me. My family defined my entire existence as an object of exchange. I agreed to a marriage contract not because I accepted that definition, but because I needed to escape the machinery of that definition. I have spent my entire life making myself invisible, believing that my only value was my utility. Standing here, I declare that I am no longer willing to accept that assessment." Elara's gaze found Silas, and her words carried a quiet resolve. "You offered me a transaction. You offered me the choice between invisibility and presence. What I'm offering you is something far simpler. I'm offering you the truth. I am not the ghost you have been searching for. I am not the girl you remember from a decade ago. I am the woman who observed your organization, who gathered intelligence, who has chosen, of her own volition, to stand beside you. Not because I was bartered here, but because I choose to be, and that choice is worth infinitely more than any transaction." The rain battered the windows, casting a mournful rhythm through the dim confines of the master bedroom. Elara sat alone at the vanity, her reflection obscured by the grey haze that had settled over the room as night fell. The city lights beyond the glass were muted, leaving the space in a liminal space between day and night. The soft creak of the door drew Elara's attention, and she turned to see Silas enter, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. When he spoke, his voice held a vulnerability that was almost unrecognizable. "When Beatrice came, when the conspiracy became clear, I doubted you. I imprisoned you in this room like you were the threat instead of the victim. I have spent a decade obsessing over a version of you that I created in my mind, and when the real version appeared, I treated her like a pawn in a game instead of a human being capable of her own choice." Elara felt something inside her fracture, the last remnant of the armor she had been so carefully constructing. "I'm not asking for protection," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not asking for you to fix things for me. I just needed you to believe me." "I do," Silas replied, his gaze finally meeting hers. "I believe you. I believe in you. I'm choosing both. I'm choosing freedom within the framework of a partnership with you. But that can only work if you learn to let me be present without trying to contain me." Silas reached out, his touch gentle as he cupped her face. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. I don't know how to love someone without trying to possess them. Then we'll learn together, Elara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her heart. Or we won't, and this will end. But at least we'll make that choice consciously instead of operating from a place of fear. In that moment, Elara allowed herself to be vulnerable, the weight of her grief and her rage and her terror finally breaking through the carefully constructed facade. The tears came, not the delicate, composed drops she had once allowed herself, but a full, wrenching collapse that left her shaking in Silas's arms. I don't know who I am, she whispered against his chest. I spent my entire life being defined by what I could do for others. I don't know who I am when I'm just being myself. Silas held her, his embrace no longer demanding or possessive, but simply there, offering the space for her to unravel. Then we'll discover that together, he murmured. That's the point of a true partnership. We don't have to know. We just have to be willing to find out. This moment of collapse was the low point from which redemption became possible. Elara had won the external battle, but the internal war, the war against her own self-erasure, her own willingness to accept the narrative of her own worthlessness, was what this collapse represented. And in collapsing, in allowing herself to be seen in her most broken state, she paradoxically became whole. Elara stood in the center of the obsidian conservatory, the glass dome casting a crystalline glow over her features as she waited. The carnivorous plants had been removed, leaving only the stark, unforgiving expanse of white marble, a stage stripped bare, ready for the final act. The eastern archway creaked open, and Elara turned to see Silas Thorne enter, his dark silhouette a stark contrast against the brightness of the space. But to her surprise, he was not alone. Behind him, shoulders hunched and eyes downcast, was Arthur Vance, Elara's father. Elara felt a twinge of something she couldn't quite name as Arthur's gaze found hers. She had expected judgment, reproach, perhaps even a desperate plea for forgiveness. But what she saw in his eyes was neither of those things. Instead, she saw a fragile, haunted clarity, as if he had finally grasped the magnitude of his own choices. You used me as currency, Elara said, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed both men. Both of you in different ways. You, father, gambled away my future. You, Silas, obsessed over me as proof of your own redemption. Neither of you saw me as a person. I was a debt, a memory, a ghost, a saint, a liability, anything but simply Elara. Arthur's voice was broken when he spoke. I know. I've known that for years. I was too weak to do anything other than what I did. Silas remained silent, but Elara could feel the intensity of his gaze, as if he understood the enormity of this moment. I'm declaring today that I am no longer going to accept that narrative, Elara continued. I am no longer invisible. I am no longer useful. I am no longer a transaction. I am a woman who has chosen to stand beside Silas Thorne, not because I was bartered here, but because I love him and because I choose to build something with him that is based on partnership rather than possession. But I am also a woman who is walking away from my father, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I cannot save you. Arthur's tears were genuine, the collapse of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his actions. I know. I'm sorry, Elara. I'm sorry for all of it. Elara did not move to comfort him. Your apology matters less than your action. You're going to have to rebuild your life without me as your foundation. That's your work, not mine. Marcus appeared then, escorting Arthur from the conservatory and leaving Elara and Silas alone in the glass chamber. Silas approached her slowly, his gaze unwavering. You know that choosing me doesn't come without cost. You know that loving me means accepting that I'm not going to be redeemed by your love, that I will continue to be a dangerous man. I know, Elara said, and I'm choosing you anyway, not because I'm trying to save you or because I owe you something. I'm choosing you because you see me, and I've chosen to finally see myself. Silas pulled her close, and what followed was not a kiss filled with possession, but one that held a complexity Elara had never experienced before. recognition, acceptance, the beginnings of something that might actually resemble love. There would be battles to fight, obstacles to overcome, a lifetime of learning how to navigate the treacherous waters of partnership. But in this moment, in the space that had once been a cage, Elara felt a sense of liberation that went beyond the physical. She had reclaimed her narrative, and in doing so, she had transformed the entire meaning of the word choice in her life. Elara stood at the window, watching Sophie play in the yard below. The young girl was learning to laugh, a sound that still seemed uncertain on her tongue but was becoming more frequent. Silas entered the room and placed a gentle hand on Elara's shoulder, the gesture one of companionship rather than possession. "She had a nightmare last night," Silas said. "I heard her crying and went to check on her. She was afraid that we would return her to the facility, that this was temporary." Elara turned to face him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that she was ours, and we don't return what belongs to us." And then I realized how possessive that sounded, and I told her that we belonged to her as much as she belonged to us. Silas spoke with a self-aware irony, acknowledging how far he had come from his original framework of understanding relationships as transactions of power. Elara smiled, a genuine expression of peace that had been hard-earned. She said, "You're not pretending to be nice, you're actually nice." I realized that she was noticing that I'm not performing kindness for anyone else's benefit anymore. I'm simply being. They stood together in the window watching Sophie play, and the scene carried an almost unbearable tenderness. This was the promised land that neither of them were sure they would reach. Not a palace of opulence and danger, but a simple space of safety, choice, and being seen. Elara reflected on her journey. "I spent my entire life believing that my worth was contingent on what I could do for others. I thought that if I was invisible enough, if I was useful enough, if I sacrificed enough, I would finally be valued. I was wrong. My worth is not determined by my utility. My worth is inherent." And choosing to believe that, choosing to act from that belief, changed everything. Not through sacrifice or through magic, but through the simple act of being present and refusing to disappear. "No," Elara said gently, "you saved me by refusing to let me hide, by demanding that I be present even when presence terrified me, by showing me that being seen is not the same as being destroyed." They did not resolve all the contradictions or complexities of their relationship. They simply stood together in the autumn light, understanding that growth is not a destination, but a choice made repeatedly, moment by moment. Sophie ran inside, laughing with dirt on her knees and wind-blown hair, and she demanded that both Elara and Silas come outside immediately to help her build a fort. They complied, moving together into the yard, into the warmth of the autumn sun, into the simple, profound act of being present together. As they worked to construct the fort, Elara thought back on the journey that had brought her here: the obsidian conservatory, the council chamber, the master bedroom, the limousine, the contract, the family she had severed herself from. All of it receded into the past, transformed not by forgetting, but by recontextualization. Those experiences were real, but they did not define her future. She was no longer the ghost. She was no longer the transaction. She was no longer invisible. She was Elara Thorne, and she had chosen this life. Not because she was trapped, but because she had finally learned that choosing herself was not selfish. It was the first necessary step toward becoming capable of true partnership, true love, true presence. The autumn sun bathed the obsidian conservatory in a warm glow, casting a gentle light across the meticulously manicured grounds. Elara stood at the window, watching Sophie play in the yard below, a contented smile playing on her lips. Gone was the haunted, guarded woman who had first arrived at this place, replaced by a woman who had found the courage to claim her own worth. Silas approached Elara, his once imposing presence now softened by a newfound understanding. "She had a nightmare last night," he said, placing a hand on Elara's shoulder. "She was afraid we would send her back to the facility, that this was all temporary." Elara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the same empathy and care that had once saved Silas's life. "What did you tell her?" I told her that she was ours, and we don't return what belongs to us, Silas replied, a hint of self-awareness in his voice. And then I realized how possessive that sounded, so I told her that we belonged to her as much as she belonged to us. Elara smiled, a genuine expression of peace that had been hard-earned. She said something interesting to me this morning. She said, "You're not pretending to be nice, you're actually nice." I realized that she was noticing that I'm not performing kindness for anyone else's benefit anymore. I'm simply being. They stood together, watching Sophie play, and the scene carried a profound tenderness. This was the promised land that neither of them had been sure they would reach, not a palace of opulence and danger, but a simple space of safety, choice, and being seen. Elara reflected on her journey, the weight of her past experiences no longer a burden, but a testament to her growth. I spent my entire life believing that my worth was contingent on what I could do for others. I thought that if I was invisible enough, if I was useful enough, if I sacrificed enough, I would finally be valued. I was wrong. My worth is not determined by my utility. My worth is inherent. And choosing to believe that, choosing to act from that belief, changed everything. Changed everything. Not through sacrifice or magic, but through the simple act of being present and refusing to disappear. "No," Elara said gently, "you saved me. By refusing to let me hide. By demanding that I be present even when presence terrified me. By showing me that being seen is not the same as being destroyed. They did not resolve all the complexities of their relationship, but they stood together in the autumn light, understanding that growth is not a destination, but a choice made repeatedly, moment by moment." Sophie ran inside, laughing, and demanded that Elara and Silas join her in the yard to build a fort. As they worked together, Elara felt a profound sense of belonging, no longer defined by the past, but firmly rooted in the present. She was no longer the ghost, the transaction, the invisible woman. She was Elara Thorne, and she had chosen this life not because she was trapped, but because she had learned that choosing herself was the first necessary step toward true partnership, true love, true presence.